Hey everyone, Mr. Langerman here, and we're going to break down the various components of an expository outline and show you how to construct them into a logical and coherent speech. The best thing you can do to get a strong grasp over the various aspects of Expos and to really understand the internal structure and organization of an outline is to watch and study as many speeches as possible. The more you study and break down the components of those finalist speeches, the better you'll be able to construct a powerful speech yourself. I've tried to put in as many examples into this video as possible to help you understand concretely what these principles look like, but the more you study them yourself, the better off you'll be. So let's hop right on in. A couple tips to remember as we're making our way through Expos. First, remember the goal. The goal of an Expos is to make me care about your topic. And this is actually an astoundingly difficult thing to do. You just have to understand that showing me fun facts about your topic won't actually make me care, especially in the world where we're inundated with so much information all of the time. Making me actually emotionally care about your topic and making it feel resonant and intriguing to an audience is very, very difficult. So I think there are two primary strategies that you can use to get there. The first is to teach me something new. Find intriguing questions and problems to unpack and explore as opposed to just giving me facts. And I really want to emphasize that last point. When I just say teach me something new, I think too many novice Expos speakers think that, oh, I will just tell my audience tons of facts. And that doesn't actually make me care about the topic, right? Instead, what you need to do is to open up gaps in my knowledge so that I care about having the information that you're going to convey to me. And so the way that you do that is by giving me intriguing problems and questions that make me realize, wait a second, there's a mystery here to be unpacked and explored. But if you don't open up those questions or those gaps in my knowledge first, then I'll just feel like you're dumping information on me that I could easily look up myself if I were to just turn to Google. Strategy number 2 is to show me unexpected ways that the topic is relevant and significant to our lives, our history, and the world. And so the key word there is unexpected. If you were, for instance, to give a speech on coffee and you were to say that coffee is very often used to help people stay alert and energized throughout the day, that's not going to teach me anything really new or fascinating about that topic. Instead, you need to show me the unexpected implications of the topic, right? What are the effects on the environment of coffee production? Where does coffee production happen? And how does that teach me something new about the topic that I never would have thought of before? Those types of questions can lead to really fascinating conclusions that make me care about the topic in ways that I would have never expected. So keep these two things in mind throughout everything I'm saying because that's ultimately the goal. And the hard thing about Expos is there are many different ways to get there, and each topic is a little bit different. And so you need to be critical about how you're going to get there. How to construct an Expos outline. The key thing that we're going to be working on in this video is creating aspects. And aspects are organized categories that help the audience to appreciate your topic and its significance. So aspects is a key word I want to use. You can functionally think of aspects as your body paragraphs, but the reason I use the word aspect is because I think it carries more connotations of an organized category. And that's the trick to an Expos outline, is creating categories, areas of analysis to discuss when it comes to your topic so that we can appreciate why it matters. So with that, let's now get to the nuts and bolts. Here are the areas that I think a successful Expos almost always needs to cover. First, where does your topic come from? So this is typically mythology and ancient religion. And you'll see most topics have this. This aspect will almost always reveal an enduring or innate obsession with the topic that transcends time. So if you remember from the aviation speech, that speaker, she discussed the ancient story of Daedalus and Icarus, and she used that story from Greek mythology as an example of the way that we have an innate desire to master flight as a human species. So that could be one aspect, mythology and ancient religion. Another could be historical origins. So when was it invented, or when did it become a meaningful part of human society? So if you were to give a speech on planes, this was obviously the Wright brothers component of that speech, the historical development of the mechanical airplane as we know it today. Another moment of that could be, for instance, if you were talking about coffee, like when did coffee start to be mass produced, or when was it discovered by Western society? When was it introduced into society and began to be drinking in the way that it is today? All those questions. Next, what is it? So this is typically more the scientific or academic explanation where you explain just what your topic literally is. So if you're talking about coffee beans, you need to explain to me, all right, what exactly is a coffee bean? Where does it grow? And why does it make us feel energized? But you need to go beyond the obvious. If you just say coffee has caffeine, which makes us feel energized, I haven't learned anything new. The question you should be asking yourself is, what do the experts know about this topic that the average everyday person doesn't? And so this is where you go beyond the obvious and the surface level. Or, for instance, in Ronan McReynolds' intelligence speech, this component of the topic is where he discussed just the biological components of the brain and neuroscience. What creates intelligence? What have scientists discovered about the connection between the biological brain and our actual intelligence? Those are interesting findings that we want to know about, right? Or in the aviation speech, this was the component where she described just literally, how does flight work? Like, how does a plane fly? And she explained those four forces that lead a plane to be able to fly. It's really important, though, that this portion of the speech, that this aspect is not boring or too technical. It's really easy to just start giving a technical scientific explanation that gets really boring really fast. So in general, the more concise, the better. And you cannot just be giving me facts for the sake of facts. Ultimately, these facts, or whatever scientific explanation you give me, ultimately needs to help the audience appreciate your topic in a new way. So if you're just telling me scientific properties of coffee that don't really have any real relevance to my understanding of coffee, it's just like you looked it up on Wikipedia and you saw all this entry on the scientific aspects of the coffee bean, I'm going to find it very, very boring. But if you can teach me something interesting about the scientific properties of coffee that help me to understand what makes it such an incredible plant and part of the reason why it has spread so far, now I'm interested and intrigued. Let's keep going. Another good topic area is how did it get to where we are today? So this is about historical development. If any of you take World History AP next year, you will hear the term change and continuity over time. And that's a good way to analyze history. And I think it's a good way to think about this portion of an Expos speech. So you'll typically talk about the origins of your topic. You'll typically talk about what your topic literally is, but then it's really useful for us to fill in the gaps of how do we go from that origin to where we are today. And so you should be asking yourself, what has changed about your topic since its origins, and what has stayed the same? And how does this development help us to understand something fundamental about the topic itself? Great questions to be asking. The next area is, why does it matter? And this is huge, right? Just because there will be many, many different things you can discuss here, many different aspects. So you could explore how your topic affects society, culture, politics, and other areas of modern life. Key point here is to develop connections between your topic and important areas of our life today that will lead to a deeper appreciation of it. You could explore cultural or societal differences and how different parts of the world relate to your topic. That's a great one. So you could show that, for instance, attitudes in, say, Japan or in European countries or in India are very different than they are in America. And ultimately, you want to be showing us what that reveals about the underlying topic itself. You could explore divisions and disagreements in terms of people's attitude towards your topic. So, for instance, if you were doing a topic like artificial intelligence, you could explore the people who are huge proponents of artificial intelligence, and you could show the wonderful benefits that AI brings to our society through the development of, say, prosthetic limbs or mechanical eyeballs that can now scan their surroundings and help blind people to finally see. But you could also show people who are very much opposed to artificial intelligence because of the fears of manipulation by governments and the control that they could bring, or the military usage of artificial intelligence. D, you could explore psychological implications of your topic on individuals. I think it's great if you can find some interesting psychological phenomenon that have terms attached to them so that we can learn a new psychological effect of the topic itself. That's always really, really great. For instance, in a speech I saw on simplicity, the speaker talked about a psychological phenomenon known as, quote, the complexity bias. And that's just a really good term to bring in because now I'm learning something interesting about what psych experts have studied about the topic of simplicity, realizing that people actually have a preference oftentimes for things that sound more complex, even if they're not actually better. Explore the business and economic dimensions of your topic. That can be really interesting as well to see how the topic has been monetized or used by businesses or corporations and sold to us. There typically can be some really interesting stuff there as well. So these are just ideas to brainstorm. It's not that you need every single one of these. If you were to have a body paragraph, an aspect for every one of these, why does it matter, plus everything else I already showed you on the previous slides, your speech would probably be too long. But these are all great areas to research into to find the best ones to incorporate into your speech. So, finally, what you'll need is the dramatic implications. And I discussed this in great length on the Developing a Topic video. So if you want to review this and you want to see more concrete examples, I recommend you go back to that video. I'm not going to be going over concrete examples of the dramatic implications in this video just because I think I covered it sufficiently in the last one, but I do want to review it because it is really important. So as I said in the last video, the dramatic implications are the unexpectedly negative side to our attitude or relationship to the topic that is adversely affecting us, a specific group of people, or the world. Dramatic implications, super important for developing that deeper emotional connection to the topic. So this needs to go beyond a single story. You need to show how it affects an entire group of people in the world. Any of those effects that I mentioned in the last video are really, really important. And finally, you want to build towards an inspirational conclusion that leads to a mindset shift typically. Maybe it's not as dramatic as an OO mindset shift where we're now dramatically changing the way we think about something, but at the very least, we should walk away with a new understanding of your topic that leads to a more nuanced perspective. But you can even go so far as to encourage us to change the way we think or act or talk about the topic. Again, Ronan McReynolds' speech on intelligence did a great job of doing this by ending this speech with by encouraging us to not limit our definitions of intelligence, to not limit it to a single type of intelligence or set of skills, but instead appreciating the diversity and different types of intelligence that exists in the world. And that can lead to a very inspirational sense of hope at the end of your speech. So now that we've gone over, I think, some of the big categories of Expos, I want to take a look and break down the structure and organization of a few different speeches. So the first one I want to look at here is actually not an Expos. It's a Vox video, Is Beauty Culture Hurting Us? But I think it did a great job of doing the types of analysis and organization that an Expos speech wants to do. Now, probably if this were to be morphed into an Expos, it would have to take more of a bird's eye view and look at the longer trajectory of beauty culture itself, going back to ancient mythological times, showing its historical development, so on and so forth. This video was primarily interested in the development of online beauty culture, so it had a more focused lens, but still, I think it was doing some really impressive stuff. So let's take a look. So it opened up this video, and I really recommend you actually just pause this video right now and go watch it. I promise I'll have it linked so that you can much better imagine what I'm talking about and then come back and watch this component where I show the structure or the DNA of this video so you can appreciate the structure and organization. But the video will do a much better job of showing you what is fascinating and interesting than me just explaining it. So pause the video now, go watch that video. All right, hopefully you found that video interesting, informative. Now let's take a look. So what made that video successful? Well, first, it had a driving question that hooked us in. And that question, according to the Pew Research Center study, they were getting at a contradiction. And that's on the one hand, more women are saying they feel beautiful, but at the same time, the vast majority of women say they feel pressure to be beautiful. So there's this sense of there seems to be a positive phenomenon going on in the modern world, but there also seems to be this intense pressure. And so how do we reconcile that, right? How do we reconcile these two opposing forces, and what effect ultimately is this online beauty culture having on us? If we have more choices, more information than ever before, then why do we feel so trapped? So these are intriguing questions, and hopefully you see that by opening the video with that question, I am now more interested and intrigued to close that gap in my knowledge and to find out more. So then they go into the history, and this makes sense, right? And they talk about the makeup marketing of the 90s, and that's filtered through official agencies, magazine agents, and so there were gatekeepers to beauty culture before the internet, and there are lots of examples of 90s magazines. So notice the organization here, right? Before we can really answer this driving question of the speech, we need to go into the history a little bit. Then after the history, we need to go into the historical development. And this is where the video discussed the idea of online platforms now democratizing beauty culture. You no longer need to go through a magazine or an agent. You can just post videos on YouTube. You can post photos on Instagram. Anybody can now be an influencer and be part of beauty culture. And so the gatekeepers are no longer there. And so there were lots of examples of the more positive aspects of the development here. But then the video went into the negative effects. And I really like this, and I think it's important in an Expos speech, is to show both positive and negative. This is what is so different about Expos from other speech topics like original oratory, for instance, where you'll get at some phenomenon that's going on in the modern world, but you'll just show the negative aspects of that thing. You're trying to prove that there's a problem and it needs to be resolved by changing the way we think. Whereas Expos, I think you can have a more nuanced perspective. So anyways, after the positive aspects of the democratization of beauty culture, the video then goes into the negative aspects, which is the sense of a never-ending cycle that creates tremendous pressure on women to look perfect all the time, and the constant comparison to others warping their understandings of themselves. So I think if this video were to just make that claim abstractly, it'd be a little bit nebulous. I wouldn't be super sold. But what really grounded this part of the video was the studies that they brought into it. And they showed that there are studies that indicate that you feel worse when you compare yourself to your peer group on social media as opposed to beautiful celebrities in magazines and in movies. Which seems a little bit counterintuitive, right? If you're comparing yourself to these movie stars who look more perfect than anybody will look in real life, you would think you'd feel worse than if you're just comparing yourself to your friends on Instagram. But this study, in a counterintuitive way, teaches me something new and surprising and unexpected that really makes me feel like I'm learning new, fascinating things about this topic, about the dangers of comparing yourself to your peer group. And then they showed us another study that found that seeing someone leave a compliment, like "you look amazing," on a pretty woman's photo, made the viewer less happy with their own body. Again, this is counterintuitive. It's not something I would expect, and I'm learning new psychological components of the topic itself. So hopefully what you're seeing here from these studies is that the funny or the quirky or the shocking facts oftentimes should be a lot deeper than just finding some 100 facts on shoes on Google, right? I don't think those sources are very good. Instead, you want to actually find really interesting sources and really interesting material about your topic and then communicate that to us so that we feel that we're learning really interesting things about it. Next, the video then went to cultural attitudes that help to explain the development of this online beauty culture. So we're now going away from the negative psychological effects to now the broader cultural attitudes. And again, they brought in really interesting studies that helped us to understand this in a more concrete way. You could imagine a speaker just saying, in general, women are more valued for physical appearances than men. But this study really helps me to understand concretely and in a surprising way what's going on here. So they talked about the language that writers use. So books that are published, they did a meta study of what adjectives are most uniquely used to describe men and women, and then they put those up on the screen. And so you can imagine as an expositor, you could put these up on your visual aids in the same way that they did just on the video itself. I even think they had a board in the video. So that way, right, you could show us the actual words that are being used to describe women that are linked to physical appearance versus men. And then again, the Pew Research Center study, they bring in a new Pew Research Center study. By the way, Pew Research Center, one of the most qualified sources for studies about polls and opinions, and tracking those amongst participants. So a great place to go look if you want to try to mine that. So anyways, they asked what traits do people in society value most in men and women? And as we'd imagine, right, for women, it was physical attractiveness and empathy, nurturing kind, whereas for men, it was honesty, morality, and professional/financial success. So kind of cutting along those sexist stereotypes and expectations. But what made this study so interesting was that teenagers of this generation actually were in greater consensus that girls are valued for their physical attractiveness. You would expect this to be more of an outdated attitude that will probably be changing in a positive way over time. But actually, this research study unintuitively showed us that that physical attractiveness stereotype is becoming more solidified amongst younger generations, probably linked to this beauty culture. So that again is a kind of shocking fact that is really intriguing to learn about. Then it goes into the psychological effects. And notice they brought in an expert, a psychologist, who called this beauty sickness. That's really good, that type of term to help ground and teach us something new. And so it talked about the dangers when we are obsessed with how women look and we value them just based on their physical appearances. And then there are lots of examples of women talking about their insecurities and the damaging effects that has on them. Next, it went into the economics and consumerism of chasing beauty. And so this is where they had lots of fun examples: microblading, cosmetic surgery, eyelash extensions, butt implants, sparkle tattooing, vampire facial, face gems. And there was a whole section on the guys in the video going to a face gym, Botox. And they had a lot of stats about like how much things like Botox use has increased since 2000 to really help to substantiate how big of an industry this is now and how much money and time people are spending on this. And then they ended on a really good conclusion, right? Which is, it acknowledges the positive aspects of beauty culture, that it's so much more interesting and approachable and diverse than it's ever been before. And that's wonderful, but maybe it can make it seem like we've made more progress than we have. Perhaps rather than just focusing on making sure our forms of beauty are diversified, we need less concern with how women look and how beautiful they are, period. And so they recommend we refocus compliments for women away from their physical looks. And then they have this great ending line. So maybe the goal isn't to change how we talk about beauty. Maybe it's to talk about beauty less. Really interesting and intriguing, right? And so I think this video does a great job of many of those components of an Expos speech that makes it really interesting and intriguing for 10 minutes. And so I'd really urge you to watch that video and to study the organizational components of what makes it effective and what keeps your interest hooked. Let's look at two other examples. Ronan McReynolds, he was a double state champion 2 years in a row. Here was his intelligence speech, state championship speech. And you can see here, his speech was on intelligence. And I have the speech text here. You can go read it in your own time. And what does he do? So he opens up by talking about the science of the brain. What is it, right? So he, down here is like, all right, to even begin talking about intelligence, we have to talk about the brain. And then he discusses just biologically what leads to intelligence. What do scientists think about that? Next, he goes to religion and mythology of intelligence, so it's mythological origins. And so this is where he talks about the Greeks and their titan of intelligence, the Egyptians, god of intelligence, Odin, the Norse god, or king of the gods, who embodied intelligence. So again, a good organization here. Next, he goes to religion and rates of intelligence today. So is there a correlation between religious societies and atheist societies and their overall intelligence? And he shows there is, and just overall rates of intelligence amongst countries. So this is about unexpected connections or kind of societal, the way intelligence plays out societally today across the globe. Next, he goes to music and intelligence. Is listening to certain types of music, especially when you're young, correlated with better intelligence later in your life? So this is about generating unexpected connections between his topic and another area of culture, music, right? Next, he goes to geniuses and genius organizations. Mensa is this one he talks about. So now he's getting to a cultural phenomenon about how do we value or look at people who are geniuses and what happens culturally when geniuses, quote unquote, get together. Finally, he ends it by getting to dramatic implications. and discussing in quite length over multiple paragraphs people who aren't viewed as intelligent. And I showed you these examples in great length in the developing a topic video, right? First, people with mental disabilities, even though they're capable of incredible feats. And second, immigrants, non-Westerners, and women, all being not valued for their intelligence in the same way that white men from the West are. And finally, he ends on this conclusion that we need to expand our view of intelligence. So really good organization here. It has a nice logical flow. And so you can see here his aspects really help to create a broad view of intelligence as a whole. And by the end of the speech, we feel we've learned a lot about the topic of intelligence. Down here, I recommend you read that speech, by the way, and watch it to see what he does. He's a really engaging and captivating speaker. Next, this was the aviation expos that we watched. And so again, look at the aspects and her organization here. She starts off with the methodological origins of aviation. So that's Daedalus and Icarus. Then goes to the historical origins of aviation. That's the Wright brothers. Then goes to the historical development of aviation. So that's World War I, atomic bombs, and Berlin airlift. Then she went into the science of how it works. Then she went into the power of aviation on our imagination. This is where she talked about how many people would want flying to be their superpower. She had an Amelia Earhart quote there that discussed how powerful flying is on our sense of imagination. Then she got to the dangers of aviation today, terrorism, drone strikes. Then she got to the positive potential of aviation. So that was helping patients, victims of wildfire, veterans. And then, of course, she got to the big dramatic example, which was about Cambodian refugees and the personal story about her father. Something I want to note about this speech, her dramatic implications were actually dramatic in a positive way. It was like a heart-wrenching story, but one that ended very well. It wasn't just negative, but I think it worked quite effectively, right? About her father being able to escape this horrible regime and come and start a better life thanks to the promises of aviation. Now, of course, she had dramatic stuff above with the atomic bomb as well as the terrorism and drone strikes. So she had both. And then her conclusion was ultimately that aviation reveals the duality of human nature, our capacity to destroy, but also something that allows us to do the unimaginable. So again, we come to a much deeper understanding of aviation. And I think a great formula to follow is always to be thinking about, you think X, but actually Y. You think X, but actually Y. Draw on the expectations we have of the topic and show us that there's actually much more to the topic than we think. You think aviation is just a way to travel around the world. But actually, aviation reveals the duality of human nature, our potential for destruction and evil, as well as our capacity to do the great and unimaginable. And when you phrase it like that, I'm now more intrigued than if you just give me facts about there are this many planes in the world and this much money is spent building planes and here was the first model of plane and now we have this model of plane. If you just give me facts like that and don't organize it into coherent aspects with a logical flow and organization that keeps me intrigued throughout, I'll lose interest. So what I'm hoping to do here by going through these examples is to teach you to look at expository speeches in this way. Or even if you're just watching videos like more Vox videos, like the one I posted, or looking at Explained on Netflix or the Connected show on Netflix, any media like that's about informing an audience of something new, instead of just watching it and saying, wow, that was really interesting, instead breaking down its organization and thinking about what are the aspects, how did they make it intriguing, what were the questions that they were asking that kept me gripped throughout the entirety of the video or throughout the entirety of the speech. If you're breaking it down into its structural DNA, then you will be able to implement it yourself. So hopefully you have a better understanding of the structure and organization. Now what I want to talk about is, let's say you brainstormed how you want to organize your speech, but now you need to start writing your aspects for the outline, right? So I can see exactly what you're trying to convey within those aspects. Notice before I was just focusing on the broadest level, bird's eye view of the organization of the speech itself, but now I want to take the microscope a little bit and look at the aspects themselves. So here's the typical formula for an aspect. All right, so let's say you're talking about mythology or historical origins. You would want to first make sure you have a statement of significance. Explain in one sentence what the aspect is and how it helps to deepen our appreciation of your topic, i.e. this is just the claim of the paragraph, okay? And I'll give you an example in just a moment. Number 2 is where you give the example or area of analysis. This is where you provide the compelling examples or explanations that prove the point you're trying to make in that aspect, in that body paragraph, while simultaneously teaching about your topic. So number 2 is like the main meat of that paragraph. If you're talking about the historical origins of airplanes, this number 2 point right here is where you're really going to dive deep into the Wright brothers and how they developed the plane, et cetera, et cetera. And number 3 is to make sure to keep the explanation snappy with a joke. And I think there are a couple things you can do here. You can first insert a punchline that subverts expectations, so just insert a straight joke. Number 2, you can have something funny or intriguing about your visual aids that draws our attention. Or number 3, you can use a funny, quirky, shocking fact. And notice in the Expos speeches you've seen, they shift and do different things. Like for instance, in the aviation speech, when she folded up a piece of paper and flew into a paper airplane and tossed it into the crowd, like that was an obvious use of a funny visual aid, right? But then at other points, as we'll see in just a moment, she used funny, quirky, or shocking facts to make it humorous, and at other times she used jokes. So let's look at an example from that speech. So first aspect is the origins of aviation. And by the way, this is about what I would want your outline to look like, this type of example. Significance. So what is her claim of this paragraph? And that's that the idea of aviation has existed since mythological times, which highlights our innate obsession with flying. So look at that. She's not just saying, let's look at the history of aviation. That's not a claim. That's not an argument. Instead, she's arguing that the idea of aviation existing since beginning of mythological times highlights our innate obsession with flying. And so she begins with the mythological story of Daedalus and Icarus. And so she summarizes this story. But then notice how towards the end, she switches to a joke. So it's not quite a funny, quirky or shocking fact that she's using here. Instead, if you remember, she started singing, "I believe I can fly, I believe I can touch the sky," while doing something intriguing with her visual aids. And then the punchline there was she got a straight dead face and said, "Yeah," and then his wings melted and he fell to his death. So obviously the contrast there of "I believe I can fly, I believe I can touch the sky," which is about limitless potential and dreams, is then subverted with a funny joke about him falling to his death. So she made that aspect really intriguing and snappy through her delivery and through the writing of the speech itself, which led to a joke. Then she went to the historical origin, which was the invention of the airplane. And let's see what she does here. So she discusses, obviously, Wilbur and Orville Wright, and she talks about how they developed the airplane in 1903. And then she inserts a funny, quirky, shocking fact at the end. She says, in fact, they were inspired by birds and even went so far as to sit on a bird to study flight. The bird they sat on is currently in display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. So that's kind of funny, right? You didn't know that. And it's kind of like, whoa, that's bizarre and quirky, right? That they were literally sitting on a bird to study flight. That makes no sense. Pretty hilarious, right? And so that's the deployment, or the way that you deploy funny, quirky, shocking facts. You need to make sure that when you're using funny, quirky, shocking facts, they're not just random and out of nowhere and feel like they have no connection to the aspect as a whole, but rather they help to supplement some key point that you're making. So if you're talking about the Wright brothers as the historical origin of the invention of the airplane, then find a quirky, shocking fact that helps us to understand their process to invent the airplane that teaches us something new. That's the correct use of FQS facts. So hopefully this makes sense what I'm looking for here. This is what I would expect your aspects to look like. Having a good significance that states the topic sentence, having a good little header that explains the aspect, and then having complete sentences to craft the aspects themselves. So now that you understand the core structure of an aspect, I want to talk about the art of making aspects good. And so the most important element of good aspects is brevity. The biggest mistake you can make as an expositor is making your descriptions way too long and your explanations too long. If the aspects are too long, they will become boring, and if they don't have any shocky, quirky, funny facts, then you'll lose your audience. So you can imagine that Wright brothers one, right? She was probably super tempted to have 6 to 10 sentences just explaining how they developed the airplane and the history of that. But I promise you that it will be boring to an audience, right? Even for you, and this is the trick of writing a good expos, is for you who's researching the topic, you'll probably find this stuff really, really interesting because you obviously have an interest in this topic since you chose it. You cannot assume that the audience has an innate interest in the topic, though. And if they don't have an innate interest in it, then just dumping historical facts on us or just facts of any sort on us will feel very, very boring if it goes on for too long. And so it's really crucial to be concise. And so the art of expos, and you will be assessed on this in the outline, is to take processes, descriptions, explanations, and timelines that might regularly take several lines, not punchlines, just several lines, and shorten them into one concise sentence with a punchline, okay? And you will absolutely be assessed on this because this is such an important component of expos. If you have something that's 12 sentences long, it will not be good. But if you can condense it into 1 or 2 sentences, then it actually might be effective. And so the length is a really important way that I can evaluate whether or not it's worth putting into the speech or not. So let's look at some examples. Let's say we're talking about coffee. This would be a classic example that I always see novice expositors do, where they're like, all right, I want to talk about the process of making Peruvian coffee. And now just listen to this when I say this out loud and feel how long and boring it gets so quickly. The process of making Peruvian coffee is an art form long held sacred by the native people. First, the beans are harvested from the crops in the late spring each year. Next, local brewers allow the beans to bake and dry out in large vats and set in the hot sun for 8 days. After they're completely dried out, the beans are then taken into homes and roasted over a fire with the special tree leaves that give the coffee its unique flavor. Finally, the beans are pressed and ground by hand into the perfect mix for a steaming hot cup. So, it's not terrible, but look, I think that entire thing can be condensed basically into a sentence where you just say, Peruvian coffee is a sacred art form of the native people that involves great effort in harvesting, long periods of roasting over special kapok tree leaves, and finally, grinding up the beans for that perfect cup of joe. So notice how much easier it was to follow that second sentence because it was short, it was concise, it was to the point, and it didn't elongate that explanation. It didn't make it boring by going into too much detail. And so that's a lot of what you're being assessed on in an expos. And the heart of making a great expos is your ability to cover many different aspects and areas of your topic by having very concise explanations that get to the point. And this isn't about dumbing down these explanations. I actually don't think a lot is lost in this second one here. Instead, what you need to ask is, what is the core component that I need to convey? And so this is actually about the art of prioritizing what is actually important and what isn't. And so that is not dumbing down. That's actually smart writing, is getting to the heart of what you're trying to say and cutting out anything that is extraneous to that. So let's look at a poorly written aspect. And you can see here in this example, I recommend you pause the video and read it. I'm not going to read it in length. It will just take too long. It's not worth it. This was a speech on chaos. And you can just see here looking at it. The point he's making is basically just about the idea, the scientific idea of chaos, which is entropy, right? Why isn't the universe structured by order? Why is it structured by disorder? And it's an interesting idea, something you certainly want to cover. But my goodness, my advice for this expositor, I told him he needed to reduce this to 2 sentences. And he was able to, and it was so much better once he did. But right now, having a giant paragraph to get there, it just makes it so that your audience completely, their eyes will glaze over, they will get bored, and you will lose them entirely. So pause the video and look at this, because if your expos aspects look like this, you will lose points. Okay, so hopefully you have an idea of what a poorly written aspect looks like when it's too lengthy. Let's look at another one. I'm going to read this one out loud. So it says, soon advertising moved from laborious carvings to a simple printing presses. This was, by the way, a speech on advertising. Advertising was the topic. The first official print ad was published in 1517 when a man named William Caxton nailed his 95 Theses. Sorry, that was Martin Luther who nailed them to a church door. An ad for his book, Sarum Pi, or the Priest Handbook to a Church Door. Finally, in 1704, the Boston Newsletter printed the first somewhat recognizable newspaper advertisement. In 1888, Sears became the first and most successful company to advertise directly to consumers by mailing catalogs directly to people's homes. This novel form of advertising resulted in an expansive success for Sears, which produced 2,000 new orders that year. By the way, the Sears catalog served another important purpose in modern society. In the late 19th century, the Sears catalog became the toilet paper choice for rural America. Often hundreds of pages of free, absorbent, uncoated paper arrived just in time for those rugged individuals. Unfortunately, the glossy papers of the 1930s did not quite serve the same purpose as companies vied for space for their products in Sears catalogs and later in department stores. Woof. There's actually some interesting stuff in here, but do you feel how especially that Sears example, when it stretches on how many sentences? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When it stretches on 6 to 7 sentences, you just lose the audience, right? And so if that was just converted, if that was condensed down into 1 or 2 sentences, I think it'd be good. And same with the historical stuff above. It just stretches on a little too long and it's too lengthy. You need to condense that first part of this paragraph into maybe 2 sentences. Overall, I think this entire aspect that we see here could be condensed into 4 or 5 sentences max, and that would be much better. But when it goes on this long, you lose the audience. So this is super important for Expos and something that I'm going to be holding you accountable for. Let's look at this now. So this is Ronan's speech on beauty, another state championship speech, and let's see what he does in this one. Look at how much more bang for his buck he gets by exploring different areas of the halo effect, as opposed to in the last one we looked at where we didn't get a lot out of that, given how long it was. So it says the halo effect is a cognitive bias based on overall impression. For example, when people see someone like Beyonce as attractive, they automatically begin to think of her as talented, intelligent, kind, funny, hence the halo. Yeah, Beyonce, we can see your... And then Ronan actually burst into song here and sang Halo by Beyonce, but purposefully made his voice really off-key. Humor. Researchers at Cornell University released a study in 2010 that showed that unattractive criminals definitely do not have a halo when being convicted and receive about 22 months longer in prison on average. However, you don't have to have committed a crime to be punished. Less attractive children are more likely to be punished than attractive ones. That is said to be true in the classroom, where teachers see more attractive students as more capable academically. So maybe if I looked more like this and less like this, he showed visual aids here that were humorous, I wouldn't have failed that chemistry test and therefore had to listen to my mom sing all week. If you like it, then you should have got an A on it. So what's going on here? What makes this effective? First, I think at the top, right, he does a good job of giving us an explanation. There's a cognitive bias that affects the way that we view people. He explains it, and notice he adds a joke there with the Beyonce and him bursting into song. The next he jumps into, and notice that he does this in just 1 sentence, a Cornell University study that found that unattractive criminals end up having longer prison sentences. Interesting. Then he transitions to this implication in schools. Again, a new study, a new implication, really fascinating, right? That we find out that this halo effect affects students and how they are punished. And then he ends it, of course, with a joke about him failing his chemistry test, as well as a self-deprecating joke about him not being attractive. Funny, right? So notice how much more we have learned from this one paragraph than we did in the last one, where there was just a dumping of historical facts that might be kind of intriguing, but weren't very fascinating, right? And stretched on far too long. Here's another good example. So this is in the beauty speech as well. It's at an earlier component, and he's talking about fashion shows and beauty competitions. So he's like, they extend all the way back to ancient Greece. The story goes that goddesses Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite came down to earth and asked the goat herd Paris who was the fairest of them all, because naturally a herder of goats is the prime judge of beauty. Notice the joke there. Paris chose Aphrodite, who offered to give him Helen of Troy as his wife, but the Trojan horse in this deal? Well, it was the Trojan horse and the Greek army inside. So again, a joke, right? So he draws on that mythological origin, establishes it very quickly, and then transitions. It was in 1921 that the first Miss America beauty pageant was planned, and it didn't take long for some interesting knockoffs. So notice he went straight from mythological origins to historical development in this speech. Since then, we have Miss Navajo Nation, where the contestants had to butcher a pig live. But did you hear them swining about it? I don't think so. They looked gorgeous. Notice all the puns. We had Miss Atom, where contestants had to work in the nuclear industry. Oh, they were bombshells. And Miss None, which, well, God knows what that was. So notice here, he's actually incorporating funny, quirky, shocking facts by making them even funnier by adding jokes and puns on top of them, right? Finding out that there's a Miss Navajo Nation where they butcher pigs, finding out there's a Miss Atom Bomb, and finding out there's a Miss Nun. Like, all those things are so bizarre and quirky. And so he's done a good job of showing the historical development of fashion shows and beauty competitions by sprinkling it with funny, quirky, shocking facts, and never spending too long on any one of these, right? Quickly going from one to the other to keep our interest alive. Here, let's look at, I think, just one more. So this is on the speech on tears. And so this is one where Sahil Sauji ended up going into why we cry in the first place. So this is that, like, what is your topic? What are tears? Why do we cry? He says, each of these landscapes correspond to a reason why we cry. First, we cry basal tears, which lubricate the eyes. It's like eyes sweating. Then we reflect. Then there are reflex tears, which wash away harmful irritants. It explains why we cry when we cut onions, and as it turns out, even figs. Figs? Finally, the tears you know and love. Emotional tears which respond to our basic emotions like joy, fear, and sadness. To express and communicate our emotions to others, we cry, or in my case, ugly sob. The Wallenberg Institute of Ethics writes that emotional tears are especially unique because they contain mood-regulating hormones which render a more calming effect. So that's why I cried during my SATs. So notice here, it'd be really easy for that first paragraph to get really boring as he just describes different types of tears. He keeps it snappy and interesting, though, through some jokes and interesting, funny, quirky, shocking facts, like the fact that we cry when we cut figs. Or second, he made the joke about his ugly sob. And then third, that interesting study from the Wallenberg Institute that shows that emotional tears end up containing mood-regulating hormones which calm us. Very fascinating, right? Keeps that aspect interesting. Next, he says, since our tears serve many purposes, our eyes produce them all the time. In fact, your body produces 15 to 30 gallons of tears each year at a rate of 2 microliters per minute. And to all of you savory fans out there, it takes about 27 days to produce salt from tears for our fries. And while most normal people think disgust when they think of using the salt in our tears for food, others thought business opportunity. The Hoxton Street Monster Supplies, a store in England, sells a variety of tear salt. Somehow the business of tears has been so great that Hoxton has been open since 1818. So I think I showed you this paragraph in the developing a topic video, but notice here how he makes something that seems just kind of, boring and scientific, the fact that there is salt in our tears, something really, really fascinating, right? He goes very quickly from the just biological components of tears and some scientific facts about how many gallons of tears we're producing each year, interesting, to then going to some really unexpected, funny, quirky, shocking facts about that, right? Showing how some people have actually tried to monetize selling tears. So really, really good stuff here. I think these are great examples of the art of Expos aspects where you very quickly establish points and then draw new connections to other points that you establish very quickly and don't get bogged down with long, lengthy explanations. So let's go over some final tips. First, go beyond the obvious. If there's anything I've tried to communicate in this video, it's that what makes Expos interesting is finding those unexpected implications, those unexpected connections, those unexpected applications of your topic to our lives. The more questions you can raise for your audience that are intriguing, the more connections you can draw between that topic and aspects of our lives that we would never expect, the more interested we will be and the more we will care about your topic, which is the ultimate goal. Number 2, think about your topic less literally and more figuratively. I think that's really important for concrete noun topics. If you're talking about tears or you're talking about diamonds or something like that, something concrete, thinking about the figurative meaning of it. Or aviation, for instance, thinking about aviation less as just a literal way to fly, but instead flying as a symbol of us reaching for our dreams, our aspirations, or the unimaginable can make your topic much more intriguing. 3, think through the organization of your outline. Does it logically flow? Does it sequentially make sense? And you can go back to the part of the video where I was going over the structure of various Expos speeches and that Vox video, and I recommend you study the organization of other speeches on your own. 4th, make sure all the content within an aspect helps to prove the main claim of that paragraph. Let me repeat this fourth one because I see a lot of underclassmen expositors really struggle with this. They'll have an expos, they'll be like mythological origins, and then they'll have a point, they'll be like the mythological, like we have discussed this topic since mythological times, or ancient times, or in ancient religions, which reveals our innate obsession with the topic. And then they'll just have random facts about like mythology that don't help to prove that we've had an innate obsession with that topic. Or maybe they'll argue that, I saw a speech on communication that said language can oftentimes be used to divide us. And then it just had a bunch of weird, quirky facts about how loud people could get when they shout. And it wasn't actually helping to prove the claim that language or communication can often divide us. And so when there's a disconnect there between the facts you found and the point you're trying to make, the speech won't make any sense at all. And so this will require you, don't be stuck to what you found on the topic proposal stage, right? That was just your initial research. You shouldn't think of that as like, okay, I need to make every single thing I found a part of my final speech, because oftentimes that'll lead you astray. What I'm talking about in this fourth tip is to not put a square peg through a circle hole. If it doesn't fit that paragraph, don't try to force it to fit, and be okay with letting go of things you found at an earlier stage of the research process if ultimately they don't make sense in the final speech. Fifth, keep it snappy and concise, and keep it interesting with funny, quirky, shocking facts and jokes, all right? And if you have an idea for something you want to do with a visual aid, put it in brackets, okay? In brackets. If you look near your Enter key on your keyboard, right to the right of the P key on your keyboard, you'll see brackets as opposed to parentheses, and I think those brackets can indicate something that you'll be doing with your visual aids, so that at least I could understand, okay, he intends to do something humorous with his visual aids. You have to make it clear what you are planning on doing, right? You can't just say do something funny with visual aids. You'd have to say show childhood photo of me compared to Brad Pitt or something like that. 6, study as many speeches and similar media like Vox or the explained videos are connected as possible. And when I say study, this really means trying to break down the structure, right? Convert it into an outline like I was showing you earlier in this video. And if you start doing that type of studying of what's going on in these speeches and other videos, then you'll really start to internalize what are the components that make for a great speech, right? Your greatest limitation at this point as a speechwriter is just your lack of knowledge and experience with these types of speeches and these types of videos. And so the more that you break it down and study it yourself, the better off you'll be. And that will be a better teacher than anything I could do. Finally, don't procrastinate. You should be working all week on trying to perfect your outline and craft it. And make sure to attend student coaching if you need help. So those are my tips, guys. Hopefully this helps. At the end of this video, you should have a better sense of big picture, bird's eye view, how you should be organizing and structuring and sequencing an Expos outline, and some ideas and tips for how to do that. And second, you should have a good sense of how to craft the specific aspects for each of those points, all right? How to make them intriguing, how to organize them within a body paragraph, and how to keep them funny, snappy, and concise. So hopefully by the end, you're feeling much better prepared to write this Expos speech and create the outline. This is probably one of the biggest steps, because if you do this step well, it will be very easy to convert it into a full draft. If you don't work hard on this step, though, the next step is going to be really stressful and frustrating. So keep working hard, guys. I'm really excited to see what you ultimately put together and give me as your Expos speeches. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.